Hi, everybody, and welcome to the 13th week in the semester, the 13th module in the semester, and an extremely important module, introductory material that you will study once again if you move on into becoming a major in this program. This week, you're going to be reading about communication law and regulatory policies impacting mostly things here in the United States. And so one of the things I want to do is chat a little bit about the international situation. But this is about communication law and regulation in the digital age. A very, very complicated time because very often, as is the case with other laws and policies, they're slow to catch up with technological innovation. Many of you are intent on becoming professional communicators. You want to move into the realms of advertising or public relations or integrated marketing communication. You want to become journalists. The law and regulatory policies impact in significant ways those professions here in the United States. In some cases, the laws protect, for example, journalists. They even protect, to some extent, advertisers in terms of things like free speech. There are also limitations in terms of what you can do. The responsibilities for communications professionals is incredibly important and incredibly weighty. And that's why we are looking at that issue in this chapter. Again, with the case of ethics, I think it's interesting that these chapters are very often at the end of books in a semester. And perhaps it's important that you become familiar with those elements of the industry in terms of traditional mass and emerging media and generate some interest in those. And then later on in the semester, you're exposed to some of the laws, regulations, and policies. I just want to brush over a couple of general things and have you consider. For those of you who become majors in our program, you will be required to take a law course. And our communication law course is taught by Professor Stephen Bates, who is a Harvard Law graduate. And you're extremely fortunate to have him as an instructor. I think you'll enjoy his course. But let's move on. Let's talk a little bit about the First Amendment. Many of you heard about the First Amendment, but maybe you have never read the First Amendment. Here it is. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech. That's freedom of speech and your ability, within certain limitations, to go out onto the street corner, as we sometimes have people doing up and down Maryland Parkway here, and expressing your views, as long as you don't step over the line in terms of things like hate speech and inciting civil disobedience. Or of the press, and this is the key term, or of the press, freedom of the press. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of or abridging the freedom of the press. Now, this is not absolute in our country. There are limitations. In fact, every year there is an international survey conducted of over 1,500 working journalists who operate within countries where there are varying degrees of freedom of speech. And the United States, in these 200-some countries, falls down into the high teens or the early 20s. I think the last time I looked at the survey, it was about number 24. The only country in the globe that has absolute free speech is Denmark, where in combination with the parliament and the royalty in that country, they exercise absolute freedom of the press. Or moving on, or of the right of people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. You can communicate and criticize your government and ask them to change things. But key for us in this phrase, this covers a tremendous amount of ground, is Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment or abridging the freedom of the press. It's incredibly important. It's incredibly sacred. And you might be surprised to learn that some countries that we would think have First Amendment laws don't. Great Britain, for example, the press there do not operate with the same freedoms enjoyed by the press in the United States. You will study the First Amendment extensively, not only in this chapter, but when you take courses from Professor Bates. Even though there is absolute, or even though there is protection in this country in terms of the press. I also want to provide some exposure to certain areas of this chapter that discuss, in broad terms, things like controls on freedom of the press, a separate issue relative to the idea of libel, and talk a little bit about censorship. Even though there is freedom of speech in this country and in other countries, there are things that certain institutions like governments can do in order to try to influence and control what the press publishes. So, for example, and this has been well documented, if you are a White House correspondent working for a major television network in this country, you enjoy the privilege of being able to sit in the White House in the press room and cover stories and have your videographer work with you and file your evening reports out on the White House lawn. If you go too far in your reporting, if you discover something that may reflect poorly on the presidency, if you're very aggressive in your reporting of that story, there's a really good chance that White House information officers are going to become more withholding of information to you as a form of payback for, in a way, you're having broken the rules of being a White House correspondent. So, and this is true in professional organizations, corporations, other public institutions, nonprofit organizations. In some respects, this is what public relations is all about, trying to control the flow of information in a positive way and cut off information, or if you can, freeze out reporters if you don't want them reporting something about your organization that you think is potentially negative or deleterious to your forward movement. Some broadcast properties or some media properties, particularly broadcast properties, cannot broadcast without a license from the FCC. Well, that's a government entity. And there are historical precedents where the White House has tried to influence the licensing of stations who may or may not be conducting themselves in the interests that are consistent with the White House. So, for example, it's a very old case, but during the Civil Rights Movement, there were times when certain television stations in the Deep South were discriminating in terms of their hiring practices for African Americans. And the FCC threatened to withhold the licenses or pull back or remove the licenses from those broadcasters if they didn't change their ways. Now, that, of course, is an example of using licensing as pressure on an organization for ultimately a good cause. But you can also see how in the wrong hands, or in other governments or our own, where sometimes the threat of losing one's license to broadcast or to operate could also have a chilling effect on how you do your business. And of course, tax structures are also a way that one can go about this, threatening to raise taxes on an entire organization or part of the industry in terms of media if they don't behave. You'll also read about libel, which is essentially printing false material about a person that damages their character or reputation. Slander is if somebody says this on air or over the radio or in public, speaks essentially false materials. You'll discover, if you take my courses in global media, that libel laws are a way of censoring newspaper content in a lot of foreign countries. Countries, for example, in the Central American area or in South American area, where journalists don't enjoy libel protection as much as they do here. There are First Amendment laws or free speech laws in other parts of the world, but sometimes journalists find themselves out on a limb without the defense or the protection of the publisher if they print something, regardless of whether it's true or not, about a politician. So you'll read about libel. You'll also read about censorship. Now, of course, censorship runs the gamut, and you'll read about conditions under which censorship is exercised in this country, including pornography. And you'll read about the famous Supreme Court cases that reviewed censorship. And of course, I think this is one of those instances where the Supreme Court exercised extremely good judgment and said, you know what? We think we know what pornography is, but we're not going to step into these murky waters. We are not going to develop policies for this country dictating what might be variable tastes across this country in terms of what constitutes censorship. We're going to let local community standards dictate what they consider, for example, obscene or pornographic material. And so there are community boards, and this is handled different ways in different parts of the country. But say a film comes along that's highly controversial nature, that is an X-rated but mainstream film, or it's an adult-only film. A publication or review board, a citizen community board in Salt Lake City has been known to ban those kinds of films and not allow them to be aired in local theaters in that area. Whereas in other communities, for example, Las Vegas, they might do just fine. So you'll read about censorship and local community standards and how the Supreme Court weighs in on some of this and in other cases doesn't. You're also going to read in the back end of this chapter about the FCC. Now, we've touched on the FCC in previous chapters, particularly those having to do with radio and television. And the FCC, of course, controls a lot of things that you and I don't consider. We know about that you and I don't consider at first blush. We know about the FCC regulating radio and television, but all of you probably right at this moment, some of you are watching this video on handheld devices and mobile units. All that is controlled by the FCC as well in terms of how much power they can occupy, what their frequency bandwidth can be, where they can broadcast or where they can transmit, what parts of the electromagnetic spectrum they can operate. So the FCC is also weighing in on matters of control, to some extent censorship, and you'll read about the important role they play. Sometimes very behind the scenes, but central in terms of what occupies and influences your situation on a daily basis. As I've mentioned before, this chapter doesn't talk too much about domestic versus international perspectives, but I just want you to entertain the idea and realize that a lot of what goes on in this country isn't duplicated in other countries. We have a very unique media system here in terms of how it's propagated and in terms of how it's supported, primarily through the sale of advertising or subscription sales. That's very different in a lot of other countries. And as a result, they also have very, very different laws governing what they do. The Western European countries mostly operate under what's known as a social responsibility model. And people there have very, very different views about the role and the function of news, the role and the function of the arts. And that, of course, impacts what they can and can't do in terms of creative and artistic effort. Germany, for example, has some very, very powerful laws about making sure that the history does not duplicate itself there in terms of the rise of fascistic or Nazi regimes, and want to make sure that they're very closely monitoring things like race and hate speech that may find itself in all kinds of content, including that out on the internet. I've also mentioned early on that not all countries enjoy on a graduated scale downward, with the United States fairly high on that list of countries globally, things like freedom of the press. It is not something that's enjoyed by most people and enjoyed by most journalists globally. And it's something that we should hold sacrosanct and that we should protect and that we should practice responsibly in terms of what we go on into in professions here, whether it be advertising, IMC, public relations, journalism, or what have you. So those are some of the broad strokes I want to touch base with you here on this chapter. It's an extremely important chapter. It's seed thought for the future when you take a law course later on that's required of all of you. So I hope you'll study this chapter. Law at first blush can appear dry and unimportant, but you'd be amazed at how bedrock it is in terms of influencing our lives in an everyday basis. That's it. We'll get back to you with the second from the last chapter in the semester starting next week. Thanks so much.